Welcome to Monobiology. In this lesson we're going to learn more about the plant cell and the animal cell, more specifically the parts or the organelles of the cells. It's important that you kind of build on your already existing definitions for these things. I know you learned about these in junior high and you had some analogies, but I want you to make sure you build on those. It won't be acceptable to reuse those analogies in this course. So make sure that you build your understanding of what each of these things does. And I'm going to try and give you some basic definitions as we go through. I want you to label your diagram that you have in front of you, but also I want you to write some definitions as we go through. Okay, so I'm going to help you label this, and I'm also going to give you the definition of each of these things. So here we go. Start with the ribosomes. Now the ribosomes are these little blue dots here. Those are the ribosomes. Okay, so you can see them. They're kind of all different locations throughout the cell. Now, on your picture, obviously it's not in color, so you won't see that, but you should see the little dots. Okay, so these here are examples of ribosomes, but there's also ribosomes over here. Right? There's lots of ribosomes all spread throughout the cell. So you find a location that works best for you, and you go ahead and label that. What do ribosomes do, though? Well, two words. They make proteins. That's what they do. In the textbook, they might say the site of protein synthesis. Well, synthesis means to make. So makes proteins works for me. That's how I remember it. All right, let's go to the mitochondria. All right, the mitochondria is the site of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is an activity in the cell that makes cellular energy. And cellular energy is called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. If you're in Bio 11, you don't need to worry about adenosine triphosphate. You can write ATP. If you're in AP Bio, you do need to understand what adenosine triphosphate is. All right, but it's the site of cellular respiration. It makes energy, or ATP, for the cell. Let's skip the nuclear membrane for now. Let's go to the cell wall. The cell wall is the barrier located on the outside. You can kind of see there's like a layer here and a layer here. This part here, that kind of goes along like this, is the cell wall. Okay? Now, a lot of people think that the cell wall is like, basically controls the movement of materials into and out of the cell, but that's the cell membrane. That's what the cell membrane does. The cell wall is a structural piece, okay, that prevents a plant cell essentially from exploding. Because a plant cell will fill up with water. And when it fills up with water, if it was to continue to fill up and fill up and fill up, it would explode. And that would be bad for the cells, because plant cells need lots of water, but they can only hold so much before, it'd be kind of like a balloon. They can only hold so much before they would pop. But if you put a balloon inside of a box and blow it up, it'll only blow up so big, and then it won't blow up anymore. Well, that's essentially what the cell wall does. It also kind of, in terms of the structure of a plant, cell walls kind of are able to allow cells to stack upon each other, and that's how plants can grow as tall as they do, right? Because they don't have like a skeleton like we do. So cell walls kind of hold give the cell structure and shape, but also allow it to have a little bit of stability, right? So it can be stackable. All right, let's move on. The cytoskeleton. Okay, so this one here, I'm going to move this down here like this. There's two different parts to this. I should move it back over here. You've got the microtubules and the microfilaments. Now, those two things are part of the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is essentially a network of fibers inside the cell that essentially kind of hold all the organelles in place where they're supposed to be. Right? So they don't move around, because the cytoplasm, which we'll get to in a minute, is a fluid part of the cell. And, in a fluid, things can move. Right? Organelles would move around, right? If the plant moved, the organelles would all shift to that side, sway back and forth in the wind or something. We don't want that to happen. So the cytoskeleton, the microtubules and microfilaments, essentially prevent that kind of stuff from happening and hold the organelles in place. Okay? Now, in terms of labeling these, the cytoskeleton, I wouldn't necessarily label it. The microtubules are these purple kind of guys right here. You can see them spread. There's kind of like all throughout, right? And then if you look really closely, you can see kind of little yellow tiny fibers through here. Right? Those guys are the microfilaments. So if you want to label the kind of purple ones here, and I know you don't have colors on your sheet, but you should be able to identify where these are. These are the microtubules, and then these skinnier ones are the microfilaments. And again, they're all part of the cytoskeleton, which helps hold the organelles in place. All right, let's move on. Next one we have here is the vacuole. And you can see there's actually a couple of different vacuoles inside of this plant cell. Plant cells often have a very large central vacuole. Now, what do vacuoles do? Vacuoles basically, mostly, store water and help the plant maintain what we call turgor pressure. As I said before, plants want to fill up with water. They need water for their everyday functions. And so when they fill up with water, their central vacuole would take up a huge space inside of the cell. It would get even bigger than this. And that's important for a cell, as I said before, to maintain its rigidity. You ever have celery? If you put it in the fridge for a few weeks, you'll notice that the celery gets all floppy. Well, what can you do to prevent that? Well, you can actually cut the bottom off the celery and put it in some water, and guess what? It'll stay crunchy. Right? It won't get as floppy on you. So, that's where the large central vacuole, and plant cells have them, but animal cells don't. Okay, so that's the large central vacuole. It stores water and sometimes other things too, but the main idea is water to maintain turgor pressure, to keep the cell really rigid. All right, so now we've got the cell membrane. It's sometimes called the plasma membrane. You may have heard of that before. And the plasma membrane would be this inner, we already talked about the cell wall. The cell membrane would be on the inside. Right, see this other layer that's on the inside here? That would be the cell membrane, this guy here. Okay, and the cell membrane controls the movement of materials into and out of the cell. That's what it does. It's selectively permeable. And selectively permeable means that it only lets certain things in or out. It's not like an open door or an open window. It only lets specific molecules in or out. Okay, so that's what the cell membrane does. Chloroplasts. Okay, chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis, only found in plant cells. Well, between plant and animal cells. They're only found in plant cells. They're also found in like algae and stuff like that, but we'll get to that later on. Between the plant and the animal cell, they're only found in plant cells, but they are the site of photosynthesis. They contain a pigment, a green pigment, called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is basically what allows photosynthesis to take place. And what does photosynthesis do for the plant cell? It makes sugar for the plant cell. Okay, so we said before that the mitochondria, which is this guy over here, is the site of cellular respiration, which takes sugar and makes it into energy for the cell. Well, this guy here makes the sugar. The sugar is made here, passes the sugar on to the mitochondria, and the mitochondria then turns it into useful energy for the cell. So they work hand in hand. They work together. Light energy is required for the process of photosynthesis. So that's what the chloroplasts do. They convert light energy into chemical energy in sugar. And that's how it works. And that's how they make their own food, which is kind of cool. Okay, we have the smooth ER. Just going to put it here and draw a line for you. And the smooth ER is an organelle, again, that is used to make lipids. Now, lipids are fats and oils. Okay, so we already talked about the ribosomes being the site of protein synthesis. Well, the smooth ER is the site of lipid synthesis. It's where lipids, which are fats and oils, are made. The rough ER, which is that guy right there. There's also a rough ER up here, you can see. Now, how do I know what's the difference between the smooth and the rough ER? Well, the rough ER has ribosomes attached to it, as you can see here. And so since the rough ER has ribosomes attached to it and the smooth ER doesn't, the rough ER is used to make and modify proteins. It makes and modifies proteins and then ships them to other places within the cell. Okay? The smooth ER also makes and modifies lipids and ships them to other places in the cell. They both do essentially the same thing, one with proteins, one with lipids. And that brings us to another guy over here who's called the Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus is this guy here who kind of looks like a stack of pancakes. That's how you tell the difference. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between the smooth and the rough ER, the smooth and the Golgi. But the Golgi is like a stack of pancakes. You can kind of see the difference between these two. So this is the Golgi. The Golgi apparatus is responsible for transporting materials throughout the cell, including transporting materials that are going to leave the cell. Okay, so it receives things from the smooth and the rough ER, and then it modifies them, repackages them, and then ships them where they need to go, whether that be inside the cell or outside the cell. And that's what the Golgi apparatus does. Okay, so let's talk about the cytoplasm. Now the cytoplasm, it's hard for me to label it specifically on here, but the cytoplasm is all the area in between the organelles that is kind of the fluid medium of the cell. Okay? All right, let's get to the nucleus now. All right. Let's get to the nucleus. Okay, so the nucleus is this golf ball-like structure at the top here. And the nucleus, you've probably heard the definition before as the control center of the cell, but the nucleus is actually a little bit more complicated than that. The nucleus contains the DNA. And the DNA is a blueprint. This stuff in here, squiggly stuff, you can see those squiggly lines, that's the DNA. The DNA contains blueprints to make the proteins that the cell needs. Now, without proteins, a cell wouldn't work. It wouldn't exist. So when we say the nucleus is the control center for the cell, it's because it has the blueprints to make those proteins. And it basically tells the cell what proteins to make and when. All right? So that's the nucleus. Now the DNA in this particular instance, because the cell is not undergoing mitosis, is called chromatin. Chromatin is elongated, thin pieces of DNA that are essentially in the nucleus during times not mitosis. So when the cell isn't dividing, you have chromatin. Now, when mitosis is about to occur, we actually end up with condensed DNA called chromosomes. You've probably heard of that before. Okay, but either way, DNA, chromatin during non-mitosis, chromosomes during mitosis, that's what's inside the nucleus. There's also another structure inside the nucleus called the nucleolus. Now the nucleolus makes ribosomes. Another two-word definition, gotta like that. So it makes ribosomes, and the ribosomes then are shipped out of the nucleus to the cytoplasm or to the rough ER. Let's talk now about the nuclear membrane. So the nuclear membrane is a membrane that, in essence, controls the movement of materials into and out of the nucleus. Right? That's what the nuclear membrane does. Only specific things. It's also selectively permeable. It only lets certain molecules into and out of the nucleus. Okay, so the nucleus itself would be this whole structure here, and the nuclear membrane would be like the border of that. Right? It's like the border of that. The nucleus would be the whole thing, everything inside of it, and the nuclear membrane would be the membrane that's around it. Now we've got one more little structure here called the nuclear pore. If you look at this structure, the nucleus that is, it looks like a golf ball. It's got a little bunch of little holes, kind of, divots in it. Well, those little divots are the nuclear pores. Now, those are important because they allow specific molecules to either enter or leave the nucleus, ones that the cell wants to enter and leave the nucleus. And so that way it can avoid any kind of problems with the nuclear membrane. The nuclear membrane only lets certain things through. Well, those pores allow these molecules to get through. It's kind of like giving them a pass, right? They get past the border guards. They can't, they can get in and out without too much hassle. It's like a passport. All right, vesicle we'll talk about on the next one, but that.
Ms. Creaser to the
that is essentially all the different parts of the plant cell. Now here's the good news. We're going to move to the animal cell now, and the animal cell has most of the same things. There's a couple of differences. So we're only going to talk about the differences. Okay, so you should be able to identify all these same parts that I've talked about here, except for the chloroplast and the central vacuole, because they don't exist in an animal cell. You should be able to identify all those other things on the animal cell. So let's move over to the animal cell. Okay, so here we have an animal cell, and I think you'll find most of the parts we talked about, and you should go ahead and label those. However, there are also some other parts that an animal cell has that a plant cell doesn't. For example, some animal cells would have a tail-like structure called a flagellum. Now that flagellum isn't going to be on every animal cell. It's only going to be on some. But it is an organelle that is used for movement. So cells that require movement, like sperm cells, for instance, would have a flagellum. Right? Cheek cells would not have a flagellum. Egg cells would not have a flagellum. All right, we've got another one here. I showed you the vesicle in the other one. There wasn't really a vesicle on there, so I couldn't talk about it, but now I have one here. A vesicle forming. A vesicle is essentially a transport bubble that exists or that forms within a cell. This particular vesicle looks like it might be forming, which means that it's probably allowing materials from the outside to come into the cell. Okay, a vesicle is made up of the same material that a cell membrane is. And so it allows things to be brought into the cell or to exit the cell. And that's what a vesicle does. All right, another part here that the animal cell has that the plant cell doesn't is called the centriole pair, and that's these guys here. And the centriole pair is thought to be involved in mitosis. It holds the spindle fibers in animal cells, but not in plant cells. So it's only found in animal cells, and we're not 100% sure exactly what the function of it is. We just know that it's involved in mitosis in some way. Here we have the lysosome. And again, lysosomes are only found in animal cells. And lysosomes are little vesicles, essentially, that contain digestive enzymes. And those digestive enzymes help do various things, one of which would be to digest old organelles that aren't functioning properly anymore, but the other thing would be to break down different types of materials that the cell brings in. Right? So for example, a white blood cell would use a lysosome to destroy a bacterial cell that it brought in. So your white blood cell eats a bacteria, and then it brings the bacteria in, and then the lysosomes would attach to the bacteria and digest it. Pretty cool. Anyway, these three organelles that I'm highlighting now, the lysosome, the centrioles, and the flagellum, are organelles that are only found in animal cells. Pardon me. The vesicles, however, can be found in both. Right? Plants need to bring stuff in just like animal cells do. Okay, so there's the different parts. Now, don't forget, you're going to label all these other parts too that we talked about in the previous one, but you've already got the definitions for those. Okay, so there's other parts to this particular activity. The following is a picture of it. Well, this one here that you can see is obviously a plant cell. You can tell this is a plant cell because there should be 3 reasons. What are those 3 reasons? What 3 things does this cell have that are different from an animal cell? And likewise, what 3 things does an animal cell have that are different from a plant cell? Make sure you bring those answers to class. That, in a nutshell, folks, are the parts of an animal and plant cell and what they do.